Nā mihi kia koe, Curtis. He pō, he ao, takiri mai te atakura he te manu, kau au tia. Tēnā koutou mihi mai nei tēnei rōpū. Ena mana ina waka na reo o Ngāti Whātua kia rake tēnā koutou. E hoa mā, kia ora mai anō, tēnā koutou, kia ora tata katoa. I want to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing recently. Because of the situation in New Zealand, we're just about to kick off a big project on social cohesion. This is Koi Tu and Sir Peter Gluckman. But I do want to go back to what I talked about in 23, which is some of the demographic changes. Between 23 and 25, some of those have changed very significantly. So there's a very new demography that is emerging around the world, and it's really quite challenging for societies. And I'll come to some of those challenges in a moment, but I want to think about, invite you to think about what that means in terms of volunteering. There was a report earlier this year about the need for a new policy consensus. I don't think that the policies that we've had for the past, this is generally in terms of New Zealand, are working in this new environment. There is a degree of insecurity and a decline in trust, which I'll come back to. So we need to work out what that new policy consensus is. If you look at the last of these are the four general comments that they make in this report, this UN report. But it talks about reimagining institutions. So what I want you to do as I go through this is reimagining what volunteering needs to look like in this new New Zealand that's beginning to emerge. We have some huge challenges, and I'm not convinced. I've not long come out of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. I'm not convinced that we either understand those challenges, we're sympathetic to what people are facing in New Zealand, or how we deal with issues like polarisation and mis and disinformation. So there are problems. My message here is that you, as part of the volunteer sector, you as organisations are probably the most important people in terms of what we're going to do. Don't look to governments to answer these questions. I don't think governments are up to the challenge. So let's go through some of those demographic changes. The first is ageing. You might have seen my question there. Does an ageing population mean more volunteers? Not necessarily. At the moment, this year, 18% of New Zealanders are aged over 65. If you remember, I probably said in 2023, when I was growing up as a baby boomer, 7% of New Zealanders were aged over 65. What's going to happen 2 decades out is we're going to become what's called old dominant, which means that over 20% of us, 23.3% to be precise, will be aged over 65. So they will be a huge part of our community. Within 7 years, we're going to see some very significant changes in our communities. So it began really around a decade ago. It's changing very significantly through the 2020s, and by 2031, the red areas are where 30% or more of the population are aged over 65. That is what we call hyper-aging. And so some communities, Thames being an example, are already 40% aged over 65. So what you're going to see is around New Zealand, the blue areas where ageing is not so significant a factor, but the red areas, over 30%, and the pink areas, between 25 and 29%. That's a huge change for our community. So what are you going to do in terms of that? And I just want to acknowledge Age Concern Wellington and how it benefits older people. There is a report, I've just arrived back from Canada and I was working out there this morning because I've suddenly seen a whole lot of new material, but there's a new McKinsey report which is on healthy ageing. And it's an international report, and there's a very interesting conclusion. The most significant contributor to healthy ageing is volunteering. Isn't that an interesting, so what they've did is they've aligned what older people do in communities, various activities, and what has the most beneficial health impact, and it's volunteering. I think that's really, really interesting. The second is we need to start talking about youth scarcity, because we've got this declining fertility, and it's occurring right around the world. The blue bubbles are where fertility is below replacement level. So again, in 23, I introduced you to the fact that replacement level is 2.1 births. So all of these are below that 2.1 births per woman over their lifetime, just to add. So sub-Saharan Africa is where our population is going to grow. By the end of this century, Nigeria will be larger than China. China has already got a fertility rate down at 1, so needs 2.1. New Zealand's at 1.5, but you can see right around the world, we're heading into an era where there are going to be fewer younger people. And I think combined with some of the economic factors and social cohesion factors, I think we're in for some challenges. This is what the chart looks like for New Zealand. You can see we bobbled around the 2.1 level, and in fact exceeded it, until we got to about 2013-14, and then it just tanks, and it's going to keep going. The government assume it's going to stabilise. Stats New Zealand assume it's going to stabilise around that 1.5 figure. I don't think it is. I think it's going to continue falling to that 1.2, which is what you find in most of Europe, 1.2 births. So it's half the number of births you require to replace your existing population. So at the moment at 1.5, we're 25% lower than we need to be. So we are not replacing our existing population by that 25% year on year. What does that mean? Well, it means, again, within a few years, there's going to be 30,000 fewer children in our education system. So what's happening is that we're seeing this contraction of the younger age groups, but the expansion of the older age groups. So it's going to be a huge factor. Again, I'm not sure we're talking about fertility decline and what this means. What causes it? Really good report from the OECD earlier this year, which is looking at it, at fertility rates. Just go to the green one, employment of parents. I don't think they mean parents. I think they mean the employment of women. So at the moment, what we're seeing is that most of our professional programs at universities are 2/3 women, except for engineering and one or two others. But most of them are, if you take law or if you take accountancy, 2/3 are women, and they're coming into the workforce really highly qualified. And to go back to something I've said to you before, when we look at highly qualified women in New Zealand and we look at their gainful employment, then the possibility of them not having children increases very significantly. We think about 25 to 30% of those highly qualified women will choose not to have parents or to have one and done. The second one, housing costs. In fact, I think it's more broadly the fact that economic factors are really impinging upon the economies of households. And so we're making decisions. Do we buy a house or do we have children? And I think it's that blunt, to be honest. And then in the blue factor, the change in attitudes towards parenthood. Millennial women and Generation Z women feel no compunction about having children, unlike previous generations. So I think there are some factors which are contributing to what's happening in terms of fertility. This is what it looks like. 1970, me, a baby boomer, growing up then, you can see I was part of that huge cohort, the baby boom generation, 1945 to 64. So you can see those younger age groups, and it gets narrower quite quickly. But then when we look this year with a population of 5.3 million, you can see that narrowing of the younger populations and the expansion of the older populations. This is a very significant change in terms of our demography. We've got huge challenges. Recently, 24th of September 2025, Treasury produced a report which said that our current policies are unsustainable when it comes to meeting the health needs of an ageing population, superannuation, and in terms of the health requirements of an ageing population. We are going to have to find some way, a circuit breaker, to think about what policies look like in the future. Dependency is the dependency ratio between the people in paid work compared to those in superannuation. When I was growing up, it was 6-1. It's now nearly 3-1, and it'll end up being 2-1. 2 people in paid work for every superannuitant in New Zealand. So our whole society and how we look after people is going to have to change. And then the final factor is that the diversity. So I had a good look. Heidi very kindly provided some of the material on volunteering in New Zealand. And I think the challenge is that as our society becomes more culturally and religiously and linguistically diverse, we actually need to respond to that in quite new ways. But let's talk about the super diversity. We've just had projections out, and over the next 2 decades, the diversity in New Zealand changes very fundamentally. And I would have said to you in 23 that, for example, a quarter of all New Zealanders would be a member of an Asian community. I was wrong. It will be a third of all New Zealanders will be members of an Asian community. So when we look around the room and when you think about your organisations, are these communities beginning to participate in volunteering for you? And again, I've noticed the report from Volunteering New Zealand in which there's a recognition that informal volunteering is growing very rapidly, and volunteering means culturally different things for different communities. So we could go out to Flatbush and we could look at that huge Buddhist temple, or look at the Gurdwara, the Sikh temple out there. And the Sikh temple, I think, provides about 1,000 meals a day free to the community of South Auckland. So there is volunteering, but it quite often is contained within religious communities or ethnic communities or linguistic communities. There are 2 components to this. First of all, our future is going to be more Māori. Tikanga and te reo are part of our future. You will be hearing, and by the way, I think it's going to be, our lead up to the next election is going to be really challenging. I think we're going to get some really anti-immigrant rhetoric, and we're going to get some anti-Māori rhetoric. I think it's going to be really disappointing. But that rhetoric is the past, it's not the future. And what this tells you is that the blue is the non-Māori, so it includes Pacifica, but you can see the hollowing out, if you like, of the younger age groups, but the increase of the old age groups. But look at Māori. Their median age is younger. Māori women have children younger. They have more children. So the fertility of Māori is not the same as the fertility of all New Zealanders. So proportions, and I'll show you what that looks like, proportions of the New Zealand community of Māori. Look at Matatini, look at the Korona Hana, the coronation of the Māori Queen a few weeks ago. You will get a sense of the vitality of tikanga and te reo in New Zealand. So yes, politicians might not like that. Yes, there are people in New Zealand who might not like that, but this is our future. And so, as the past Chief Judge of the Diversity Awards, I think there's some really good practice. And so Air New Zealand, I've featured here, PwC I've featured here. I think the principles that apply in the public and the private sector and they also apply to you as volunteers. How do you reach out and capture this talent pool as you move into the future? The second, of course, is our migration. And so that 2023, early 24 period, this is the 12 months to 2024, huge arrivals, 253,000 permanent arrivals to New Zealand, 131,000 net gain. Those figures put us at the top of the 38 countries of the OECD. We had, as a country in proportion to population, of course, we had the largest number of arrivals, the largest population net growth of 2.8%, and the bulk of that, 85% of that net growth, came from net migration. There are people leaving, but we are seeing the result of that in our communities because of our migration policies. Where do they come from? Increasingly from India. So Indians now dominate nearly all visa categories. So the figures you've got there, the bar graph is the first figure is pre-COVID, 2019. There's that really significant year, 2023-24, and then we've come back from that 2025. But you can see here, India's replaced China. China's dropping and will continue to drop. The Philippines are beginning to emerge as a major player, and you can see that the Philippines, I expect, to replace China as the second largest source country. Sri Lanka, Fiji, South Africa, and then the bottom is the departing New Zealand. I don't know why that's not more of a political and policy concern. So those figures that came out just literally in the last month, I've done the calculations, and I'm talking about, there's 2 things you need to know about this. I'm talking about primary ethnicity. Stats New Zealand released data a few months ago and said there are more than 1 million Māori in New Zealand, but they were using descent figures. I use the figures that say people tick the box that says my primary cultural ethnic identity is Māori, and that's probably about 200,000 difference between descent and ethnicity. So I'm using figures there. I've given you the under 15, so you can see the under 15s are changing. And by the way, if you start and add those up, we allow people to multiple identify. So this doesn't add up to 100%, it adds up to almost 120% of New Zealanders because people multiple identify. So it drives us nuts, doesn't it, Bev, in terms of trying to work out proportions. But what you'll notice is that I think the Māori figure is too low because what Stats New Zealand have done is factor in the number of Māori leaving for Australia. So I think it'll be higher than that by 2045, probably around 20-21%. The fastest growing communities will be Asian, and we've got to find some other way of describing them, but that's the third of New Zealanders who will be members of an Asian community, and then Pacifica. But notice the young age profile of these communities, really significant. So declining's misspelled. Let's talk about some of the challenges that you will be experiencing, but that you will need to address as people in the volunteer sector. This is the Edelman Trust Barometer. It's an international survey. It looks at a lot of different countries and it looks at what's happening. And they have identified these 4 factors as being really problematic in countries around the world. The first thing, there are 2 components that I would draw your attention to. One is that the economic well-being and the sense of economic optimism has collapsed in countries around the world. And you can see that in New Zealand. Any public poll begins to feature that. So one of the things that you are going to face is that when we look at the middle and younger age groups in New Zealand, they are going to be time and resource challenged. So there is a new reality out there for our younger New Zealanders. The second is that we've got these new politics that are emerging, which Ipsos, in terms of a recent poll in New Zealand, has called populism. And so what we see here is that the blue is New Zealand, and then the lighter blue, the teal, is global average. So when we ask the question of New Zealanders, New Zealand society is broken, 58% of us say yes. And it's slightly higher than the international. New Zealand is in decline, 60% say yes. And then who are most likely to say broken or decline? Māori, low income, unemployed, live rurally, aged 50 to 64 years. So you can see there where the pressure's coming on in terms of people feeling positive or negative about this country. And then when we begin to look at the well-being, and particularly for you guys, the impacts upon volunteering, it really is beginning to ratchet up in terms of how we are able to live our lives in New Zealand, the cost of housing, the cost of every day. And by the way, I was involved in that Tamati, the Counting the Beat program the other night. I hope you saw it because it mentioned volunteering. It was I was involved in that program as selecting the topics. So I selected you guys, but also in terms of checking it. So there are 3 more to go, and the next one will end very emotionally. So Count the Beat, it's on TVNZ at 7:30. And then we've got this declining trust. We don't trust each other, and we don't trust our institutions, particularly our politicians, particularly our media. And I think what's happened is 2 things. One is the online world has made a lot of our interaction problematic and often toxic. But the second is what COVID did to us. And so we've just, at Koi2, have just produced this new report, September, and we've got some conclusions about the way in which COVID disrupted and accelerated fractures or differences within our society. So we've got to come back to, and we're just beginning to work on a major program on what social cohesion looks like. It's going to be a huge challenge for us in New Zealand. I think it will be one of the major challenges for us in the next wee while. What do I mean by social cohesion? Here's the list, and Bev knows about this, but this is the list. I was asked to write a cabinet paper with some colleagues in 2006. Didn't go anywhere, but this is what we thought social cohesion ought to look like. And I guess what I would say to you guys is, in that process of reimagining volunteering in New Zealand, how are you responding to some of these challenges, if you were? And we're talking about doing democracy different. And I think the challenge around social cohesion will be addressing trust, but it'll also be addressing inclusion. So if the word for today for my presentation is the growing diversity of New Zealand, and therefore how you respond in the volunteering sector, I think the reimagining bit will be how do you do inclusion? I think that's how are you informed by this growing diversity? I think there's a huge problem in terms of the online world. The online anger, I mean, you will be aware that a Hawke's Bay man who was going to be charged with child pornography was planning an attack on Muslim men with a knife, and it was only picked up by the FBI, by the way, and so he is now on the day that he would appear in court. So we've got an issue here in terms of these very angry, aggressive voices appearing, and you will see it in local elections, by the way. And it is targeted at particular communities, so our MPs, particularly our women MPs and our Māori MPs, get this, and it probably is invisible to you, but it's a huge issue. So if I'm talking to you as volunteers in New Zealand, how do you increase your digital literacy and online presence? And then how do you embrace digital citizenship in what you do? You will experience online mis and disinformation, particularly when you're dealing with sensitive issues. And how can Te Aotearoa be an authoritative voice in this space? Because it is a difficult space to address. And then, of course, we've got those underlying economic issues of, I've called it precarity here, but people are feeling very precarious in New Zealand. It's a real issue. Let me wrap up, and then we can hopefully got some time to answer some questions. I am really disappointed at our political direction around DEI. I think it is deeply disappointing that we've taken it off the table, that organisations have been instructed not to include various aspects of DEI in here. I think it's really quite important in terms of various sectors, including your sector. And I'll shout out to Volunteering Auckland, who've done some really sterling work in here and looking at volunteering as a catalyst for DEI. All power to you. I think it's going to be super important. I'm going to say our future is diverse, culturally, ethnically, religiously, linguistically, and in other ways, gender and neurodiversity and so on. So it is what we need to do if we're working at the community level. I think there are some good examples. New Zealand were losing to Poland 1-0 when I came up here in Poland. It's not a bad result. But the All Whites represent New Zealand. There are 2 Māori there, 2 Samoans there, Indian, Chinese in that lineup. So some of our sports are actually what you might like to pay attention to. And the Black Ferns, man, whoo! Do they just look at, if you want to look at something while you're on your phones there, look at the, look at what they did to Emily Duplessis. So Emily Duplessis had to stand down because of an injury. She was still part of the squad, but there's this really powerful video of the rest of the squad doing a mihi to her and then a haka to her, and she responds. And it's really very emotional, but it indicates what happens when you include diversity and culture in what you do. You become a really high-performing organisation. So this is me. I think we are going to all need to improve our understanding of all of these dimensions of change in New Zealand. There are some challenges: social cohesion, economic security for New Zealanders. I think some of the things you're going to have to recognise is that you need to go out and to embrace some of these new communities. When we've been looking at sport in New Zealand, and particularly here in Auckland, there are three things that matter when sports need to recognise these new communities. By the way, last year in Auckland, 60,000 registered rugby players, over 100,000 registered table tennis players. Huge change. Rugby has dropped by 20% in the last decade at secondary school because of the arrival of immigrants and ethnic minorities into our secondary school system. So the three things we found work, one is trust. New Zealand organisations, and I'm not sure about your sector, but generally New Zealand organisations are not trusted by immigrants and ethnic minority communities. The second thing is, what is your presence like online? They operate online. And the third is language. Don't assume that people will come to your organisation, be prepared to volunteer for your organisation if you're only communicating with them in English. This is a hugely much more multilingual environment. So there are challenges, but you do a fantastic job, and I just want to acknowledge you. Kia ora tata katoa.